Hello, good evening everyone. Can be seated? My name is Sewa Mangil. I serve on the board of the Tibet Fund. On behalf of the Tibet Fund, I would like to first express our sincere gratitude to one of the world's most sacred living treasures, His Holiness the Sakya Trinzin, and one of the most dedicated compassion activists, Richard Beer. We are very fortunate to have them share with us their thoughts on wisdom and compassion for challenging times. For more than 36 years, the Tibet Fund has played a vital role in sustaining and strengthening the Tibetan refugee community. Our president is Mr. Lobsang Yendala, who you see somewhere right here. I hope you can meet him to know more about Tibet Fund's work. Recent scientific research has shown that mind training techniques preserved by the Tibetan community can change our brain. This includes increased capacity to focus one's attention, a better ability to regulate our emotions, and an enhanced application of an innate sense of compassion towards others. Just the way physical exercise can provide health and wellness benefits, so too can contemplative practices. Many schools, hospitals, corporations, and government agencies have embraced these techniques as it has demonstrated to help prevent burnout, increase collaboration, and improve sense of well-being. This makes the work of the Tibet Fund to preserve and promote this vital global asset very, very important. It is clear that this knowledge preserved by the Tibetan community can greatly benefit the world during our challenging times. Richard here has been one of the most caring supporters of the Tibet Fund and the Tibetan people in general. The world may know him as a famous movie actor. We Tibetans view him as a close, reliable family friend. You may be surprised to know that Tibetans have very strong differences in opinion. But when it comes, one thing that really unites us is a love for Richard. As a young Tibetan refugee student at Tibetan Children's Village in India, I personally remember him visiting and warmly shaking each one of our hands. Sometimes as a refugee, due to our political and economic status, you can develop an inferiority complex. The support and recognition of Richard and others helped us appreciate the value of our own culture and its potential to transform the world. Thank you, Richard. I would like to request Richard to please introduce His Holiness and lead the conversation on wisdom and compassion for challenging times.
Welcome, everybody. So as I look out here, I see so many faces that I know very well for a very, very long time. And it's a bit of a tribe. I think we're in it together. I think we've come to embrace in a deep way that we're really here to help each other and to create as much love and happiness in all the universes that we possibly can. It's a great honor for me personally to be here, and especially with His Holiness Sakya Trinzin Rinpoche. We actually met 40 years ago. I don't know if you all remember the photo shop in Lower Dharamsala, but I used to find these incredible old photos of Tibetans and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and I bought this fold-up little locket that had 4 pictures on it. One was His Holiness the Dalai Lama, one was Dudjom Rinpoche, who I had met by accident like 3 weeks before that in New York. See, who else was it? Karmapa Rinpoche, and the 4th one was Sakya Trinzin Rinpoche. I still have that locket on my altar, and I've been looking at the picture of you for 40 years. But the first time we actually met was in 1991 when we had the Kala Chakra celebration and initiation in New York City. An incredible event. Capped off the International Year of Tibet. And we had teachings then on the nature of mind. And I had an idea then to have these teachings with the senior teachers of the 4 schools. And I went to His Holiness the Dalai Lama to talk about that. I thought it was a really good idea. We wanted the Bangpo involved also, so we had 5 schools. And he was very clear about who was going to come, who should be invited. Of course, Sakya Trinze representing the Sakyas. It was the first place we went. We talked to him. And that's where we met the first time. It was, in fact, here in New York City at Kala Chakra. And one of the wonderful things about Kala Chakra, not many people were aware of this, but all the High Lamas, all the traditions were there. And there was a Kala Chakra mandala being made in Madison Square Garden. And it was right over Penn Station. So there were 4 million people every day who were coming right under the mandala as it was being made and as it was consecrated. So it had this incredible effect. I think the stock market actually went up 10%. And, the crime rate went down 25%. So it's a scientific reality that the meditation of Kala Chakra and His Holiness Sakya Trinze Rinpoche can have a huge effect on the world. I was looking at the biography of His Holiness, and I knew a little bit about it, but I really looked at the biography. It's one of those extraordinary stories that many of the older Tibetans have. And although Sakya Trinze Rinpoche is still a young man, I think he was born in 45? Yes, in 1945. So he's 10 years younger than His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But obviously they've had a close relationship since their meeting in 1951, I think it was. His growing up was in Old Tibet, his education was in Old Tibet with the greatest lamas of the 20th century. His activities to benefit all sentient beings throughout these last 60 or so years have been extraordinary. He's moving constantly, he's teaching constantly, he's blessing constantly. His interest in ecology, his interest in the world, his interest in making societies better, making things work better for everyone, everywhere. The subtlety of his mind, the practicality of his mind, and his ability to engage really difficult subjects in a language that we can understand is quite extraordinary. So it's with my sincerest, greatest, deepest pleasure that I offer now His Holiness Sakya Trinze Rinpoche to say a few words.
So today here, all the brothers and sisters, first of all, I would like to take this opportunity to extend my very warm greetings and tacitly to everyone who come here. And I'm very happy to be here and to see so many familiar faces and also so many new faces. And so I would like to thank the Tibet Support Group who very kindly arranged this meeting where I will have the opportunity to meet you all and share some moments with you. Now the thing is that in this world where we stay, there are many different people, different culture, different religion and so on. But basically that we are all a human being. We are all the same human being belonging to the human family. And we all want to be good health, happy mind, and harmonious, and peace, and so on. But due to the negative emotions, that disturbs, and we could not accomplish, there are that today in the world where we live has so many problems, the man-made problems, and also natural problems and so on. So all this, how to solve? The best way to solve is by using our human mind, which is so powerful and so much energy, so that we could put this in the right movement, then it will certainly accomplish. The most important thing is that our minds, we need to tame our minds. Our mind, which is so easy to involve with the negative emotions. And so we must make it strong so that our mind is not controlled by the negative forces, and that our mind is the basic human qualities such as the love, compassion, and the wisdom, tolerance, and so on. So these must develop, and so in this way that we could make this world a better world, a happy world, a harmonious world. And so to do that, we need the spiritual assistance to train our mind. I believe that in the world there are many different religions, and there are differences between the religions, philosophically, the approach and the way to lead and so on. But basically the aim is same. And the aim is to help mankind, to make this world a better world, people more happy and more harmonious, more peaceful. So therefore, since the goal is the same, that we can all be united, and through the unity of efforts that we can make this world more harmonious. And I myself, personally, I respect every religion, because the Buddha himself also felt that one teaching is not enough, because there are so many beings, so many human beings, so many sentient beings, that each of us, our mentality, our propensities, our negative forces are different. So therefore you need a variety. So that's why the Buddha himself also taught many different teachings, Mahayana, Theravada, Vajrayana, and so on. And so similarly, that we need a variety of spiritual traditions, spiritual aids. For example, there's not one medicine that can cure all the disease. You need different medicines to cure the different disease. Not only that, but the different the traditions or the protocols that for certain disease, the allopathic medicine is very effective. Whereas for certain disease, Ayurvedic medicine is more effective. For certain disease, the naturopathic medicine is more effective. So similarly, the different variety of spiritual tradition is necessary to different levels of the beings and different levels, different people, and different mentality. And so for certain people, Christianity is more suitable. For certain people, the Hinduism is more suitable. For certain people, Buddhism is more suitable. So therefore, what we need at this moment is that we all must be united together. Because since our whole aim or the goal is same, to help the mankind, to make man better people and more happier world. And so therefore all the different religious traditions to be united together. Through the united efforts, how to make this world a better, more peaceful, more happier, and more harmonious. And so therefore, I feel that His Holiness Dalai Lama, who has the infinite wisdom, infinite compassion, and through his skillful means, he has achieved tremendous about the uniting all the different religions of the world. He tells that one of his main duty is to unite, to make friends, to unite all the different traditions. And so we must also follow his teachings, and so that we could make different teachings and different schools, different thoughts, all can be together, and through the united efforts that we can help the mankind and the world. And basically, that I always feel that although spiritual practice is very, very important, but the first of all, base for this, the very first thing is that we must make a good human being. That is the base of all the religions. Without being a good human being, how can you be a good practitioner? Good spiritual people. The good human being means someone that who is oneself is happy, and also someone who can help others make happy, to make the whole society more happy place. And so this is very important because that we all are longing for happiness. For the sake of happiness, that we are making efforts. For the sake of happiness, every individual, every organization, every government, every country is making efforts. But due to the lack of wisdom, that although our goal is happiness, but we are creating more sufferings. So our aim and action are contradicting. Our action is to cause sufferings, and our aim is to be free from sufferings. So therefore we need the wisdom. The wisdom is very important, because whatever level of spiritual path you follow, the wisdom is absolutely necessary, because this is due to the lack of wisdom that we could not accomplish. So the wisdom is very important. And then not only wisdom, but to love, to feel, to make yourself happy, you have to love everybody. You have to practice loving kindness. And to love is very, so the loving kindness and compassion are the two methods that is absolutely essential in spiritual path. And so with that as a base, the basic human qualities that we must increase and make a good person. And the basis of a good person, then you can become a good practitioner, either Christians or Buddhists or Hindus or Islams or whatever teachings that you are following, you can do that. But by doing this, first of all, I think you have to have the base. Base is that to make a good person, to be a good person who is living a virtuous life, person who is living a life that is not harming to anybody and helping everybody, and to live in a kind of decent life. And so in this, on the basis of this, then you can grow your spiritual path. And so in this way, so tonight that we will be discussing, now I'll be happy to answer whatever questions you have with my limited wisdom, that I can try my best to to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Your Holiness. You're talking about wisdom, and I know all of us who are interested in Buddhism are trying to penetrate Shunyata the best we can, and we think that we are very good practitioners, but I have there was a horrible moment a few days ago where I was working very hard on my meditation, and then I ended up in a fight with the doorman and the super of my building. And I'm thinking how ridiculous this is. But I think it's the dilemma that we all have of having a sense of vastness of our mind and heart. And certainly anyone who has met the teachings of the Buddha, but especially the teachings of Tibetan teachers, that these dual tracks of compassion, the warm heart, and the very courageous wisdom coming together is extremely difficult in the world we live in. And I don't think there's anyone here who wouldn't like to hear how we can navigate our very complicated lives and be learning from all of these tensions that arise from being in the world, and how we can use that energy, we can use the tension, turning it into wisdom and compassion, making us better human beings.
Yes.
Oh, yes. I'm asking for advice. On behalf of all of us sinners out here tonight.
Wisdom and compassion.
Yeah, how do we achieve this goal of transforming our minds in a world of everyday tensions
I
and
think
problems?
basically the human mind is loving kindness. It's not negative emotions, because the basic human mind is loving, because our full nature of our body, like our hands, our face, our teeth, it is not good for attacking or killing or destroying. It is good for hugging or for loving kindness. And so therefore, for human beings, if one knows what are the consequences that if you face if you indulge with the negative forces such as like anger. When you have the anger, then first of all it disturbs yourself. When you have anger, you have no peace of mind. And when you have anger also, it disturbs your family. Anywhere where there's a person who is angry, there's no peace, there's no harmony, there's no happiness. And it disturbs in the whole family, whole neighborhood, whole area. And so therefore, even in, not we talk about our future lives and so on, but even in this life, it is very harmful. It affects your body, it affects your mind, it affects your family, it affects your friends. And so therefore, by indulging anger, it is very bad effect. And so by knowing that we should not, of course it is not easy for us, because we, from the beginningless time until now, that we involved with anger. So it is so easy to get angry. Somebody says nasty words, that you get angry. Somebody do something nasty to you, you get angry very easily. But if you think about the consequences that you will face if you involve with the anger, then first of all, that you realize that it is not a good thing. It's a negative thing that we must not involve. And then secondly, that we must suppress. That if you are used to it everything is possible. It may not work in the first day, it may not work on the second day, but if you do it again and again, then eventually one will be able to do it. And so therefore, to be able to do that, we need the wisdom. Wisdom is very important. Because first of all, there are three kinds of wisdoms. Wisdom that you gain through the hearing the teachings, wisdom that you gain through contemplation, wisdom you gain through the meditation. So through these, that first of all, when you hear the consequences that you face when you indulge in anger, by hearing this, that it will suppress. Secondly, through the contemplation, that it will put it down. And third, through the meditation, you can take it out, dig it out, totally, anger. So the wisdom is the, one can say, the best tool, best weapon to eliminate the anger.
Using wisdom, dealing with the consequences of anger, certainly something that if we can stop ourselves for that moment, we can feel the anger coming up and watch it. And it does dissipate, just by the mere fact that you watch it, it tends to soften. But there's the other wisdom, which is contemplating the origins of anger. Not the consequences, but the causes of anger. I'm wondering, Your Holiness, if you could talk to us about where does anger come from? Even the ability that we might have, the simple ability to feel anger, where does that come from?
Of course, there's mind, and there are also many kind of associated minds. And so one of them is anger. And so it's that there are a virtuous mind and non-virtuous mind.
And a virtuous mind is what?
Virtuous mind is like loving kindness and compassion and faith and so on. Non-virtuous mind is like anger and desire and pride and stinginess, doubt and so on.
We talk about the three poisons.
Yes,
obviously.
basically the most important thing is...
The most important is ignorance of the three poisons, right?
That's right.
I was reading one of His Holiness's books, and he was talking about anger and attachment, and of course ignorance. But he said anger and attachment are the two sides of one coin. And I never quite thought of it that way, but it's true. The two exactly the same problem emerges through this generation of anger and attachment. They feed each other, but they are generated initially from ignorance, not knowing the truth of ourselves and reality. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, from the Buddhist point of view, that there is no, we all think about the self, but if there is no self, because if there is self, it has to be either physical body or mind or name. Name is of course empty by itself. Any name could be giving a
Name is conception.
Yes. And body also, if we search every part of the body, there is no thing called self. Moreover, when we, even in the ordinary usage, we say that now my body. So when you say my body, it means the body belongs to you. The body is not you, but the body belongs to you. That's, as you say, like my house. The house is not you, but the house belongs to you. Similarly, when you say my body, the body belongs to you. Similarly, so the body is obviously not the I, not the self. And then the
You said
mind.
the same with the mind.
Mind
My
also,
mind.
because my mind. So the mind is not you. So the one who belongs to the I, who owns your body, mind, house, and everything, possessions and everything, the main owner is I. This we try to search, we cannot find anywhere. It is just from the beginning last time until now, that we have built up the habitual tendencies, very strong habitual tendencies, so that we cling as a self. Just as like we have mistaken the colorful robe as a snake. But it's not snake, but it's a colorful robe.
There is something there.
Yeah,
There is an event.
yeah, but it's not.
It's not what it appears to be.
Yes. So when you have the self, so that is the biggest ignorance. Clinging to the self is the biggest ignorance. And because when you cling as a self, then you have attachment to your own side and anger to the others.
So it assumes there is something other than me, if there is a me, correct?
Yes.
And we must protect from this other than me who may take us away or damage us in some way or hurt us in some way. Where did this separation come from? Let's assume that the truth of us is our Buddha nature, is wisdom. Where did we separate? Where did the habitual moment start? Where we started to believe in the dualism. How did that even happen? How is it possible for that to happen? Where wisdom could split into the spectacle of unreality?
I think it is basically because of clinging. Because instead of seeing the reality of the nature of the mind, which is the complete combination of clarity and emptiness, but we cling as a clarity as a one and the emptiness as a one. Then due to this, that you create the physical body as well as all the other, the ignorance and the anger and desire, the three basic poisons. And then from there arises other negative forces like jealousy and pride and stinginess, etc.
Assuming that Buddha nature is a real thing, or a real state of being, or state of consciousness, or something, that clear light consciousness is real, how could our false world be even generated or
Not in the
experienced?
sense it's not real, it is also emptiness. It's emptiness. Emptiness and clarity are indivisible.
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 They're part of each other. They can't be separated.
Yes. Emptiness is not separate from clarity. Clarity is not separate from emptiness. It's through the fire and the heat of fire.
Mm-hmm. So then, if that's true, then how could these negative states arise, albeit from being generated from basic ignorance as to the truth of clarity?
Because as I said, instead of seeing the true nature of the mind, that we cling as a self, without any logical reasons, that we cling.
Are you saying from beginningless time it's been that way? That
Yes.
we have had a false reality that we have committed ourselves to habitually?
Yes.
So the universe has begun, if there is a beginning, with this.
There are times that one can have the glimpse of the clear light, but people do not recognize this. Instead of seeing the clear light, that we cling as other things, and then it spreads.
I love the way that you also talk about impermanence. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that to us.
Yes. As the Buddha said that all compound things are impermanent. Compound things means that anything that is with the cause and condition is impermanent. Because if it is permanent, it has to exist individually. It should exist without depending on the cause and condition and independently. But there's no such things. Everything is with the cause and conditions. As long as it needs to depend on the cause and condition, then it is impermanent.
It's empty.
Yes, it is
Same.
impermanent because whenever it lacks, if one cause is lacking, then immediately it ceases. For example, to be pictures appear on the television set, you need many things. You need electricity, you need a machine, you need the wires, you need the antennas. All the causes and conditions get together, then pictures will appear. If a tiny bit of wire is missing, picture will not appear. Similarly, everything is like this. As long as when all the cause conditions get together, it will appear. The minute one of the causes is lacking, then it will not appear. So everything is impermanent. And the impermanent also has kind of two different kinds of things. What we call the gross continuum impermanent, which means that the permanent, that we can see changing, everything is changing. The seasons are changing, the colors of mountains are changing. Human beings also, the colors of the hair are changing, the bodies are changing, and the change that you see is a very...
My hair, by the way, has always been this color. It's never changed.
It's changing. That change that you see is a long time. It takes a long time to change the color. To do that, what we call subtle momental impermanence, it's changing all the time. Every minute, every second, every shortest possible moment, it is changing. And by the time you see the visible change, then it is a very big change. And so in this way, everything is impermanent. It is said that all compound things are ending with the four endings. End of gathering is separation. Wherever we gather, we don't stay. At the end, we all go separate. End of height is to fall down. No matter how high you reach, positions or wealth or whatever, eventually it falls down. For example, ancient times, the great empires that almost ruled the whole world, but today they become very small. And the end of accumulation is exhaustion. No matter how much you accumulate things or wealth or whatever, it doesn't remain. Eventually it extincts. And end of birth is death. Everyone who is born has to end with death. So that in this way, that everything is changing impermanently.
Neuroscience is starting to map consciousness in a really colorful way. There was one Mind and Life seminar in Dharamsala, I remember. I think it was Richie Davidson, neuroscientist, that presented this very bright and clear picture of how the brain perceives. There's a pristine moment, an event that the brain perceives and knows immediately. That information, that impression, fresh, clear, what I imagine Buddhahood would be, of everything is fresh and clear. Every millisecond is fresh and clear. That the brain does perceive that, but then quickly takes it to other parts of the brain to measure it against the known, previous experience, and changes that experience, the fresh one, into the known. So we never experience, certainly consciously, we never experience reality. That to me is modern science proving many truths that the Buddha discovered as a scientist himself, experimenting on himself. obviously, the work of the Buddha was all based on cause and effect. And the cause, as I've also read in some of your work, the cause of wisdom is compassion. And could you speak a little bit to the need for us to generate and make absolutely steadfast the good heart, and how that becomes the merit that will generate eventually the wisdom realizing emptiness?
Yes, as I said, the basic human nature is loving kindness because we are born with the love. We are raised with the love. And without the care and the loving kindness of the parents, the baby will not survive. And similarly, even when we are a child, we need the help of parents, friends, and so on to raise. Even as an adult also, we could not survive by ourselves alone. We need friends, companions who can share our happiness, share our sufferings, and so on. And especially as you grow older, you need more depend on the others. So therefore, our whole human life, the stream of life, is depend on the loving kindness. And so therefore, it is very important to generate this loving kindness to others, because our whole life is based on the loving kindness. And so therefore we must generate, because every understanding from our own experience, when we suffer, when we experience suffering, how unbearable it is. And when we are longing for happiness, how longing we are for the happiness. Similarly, every human being, every living being is a same feeling. So therefore, instead of caring for oneself alone, we must care for the others. Because others means countless. Oneself means just one person. Others means countless beings. So the countless being is much more important. Moreover, your own life is raised through the loving kindness. So therefore, we must generously share this loving kindness to all other sentient beings, through which then you can find your happiness, and through which you can gain the wisdom.
Thank you. There was a wonderful teaching in one of the books of Your Holiness I was reading, and it was, you were telling stories a bit about Westerners and Easterners also coming to you for very high practices of Tantra, very difficult teachings, very profound teachings, very advanced things. And your response is much more important to make yourself a good human being. And that is the basis. I mean, His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about this as well. His religion is kindness. And with the vastness that one can experience within genuine love and compassion, of course it creates the space, but also the cause for being able to engage in a genuine way the wisdom of Shunya Trinaka. So I think that was a big lesson for me to hear that from you. Thank you. I'm curious, and I always am curious, about a great teacher, a great lineage. You are the 41st in the lineage, which is the longest lineage, is it not, in Tibetan Buddhism? Yeah. Who were the great teachers in your life? Who meant the most to you?
Myself.
In your life. Yeah.
In my own life.
Yeah.
Yes, I have about 11 teachers. And one of the most important teachers is both my own father, as well as the most important one is the Kenshin Tampadoji-san. He's a great abbot from the Mall Monastery, from whom I have received the most precious teachings.
When did you start with him?
When I was 6 years old.
Really? From the very beginning? And what was it like being the student of a great teacher like that?
And he was very special. He's very kind, very loving, and great wisdom. And whatever questions that you put, he gives very clear answers. And also he got very high realization that he performed many miracles.
Can you share any of those with us?
Yes, wherever he goes, when there are famines, shortage of rain, that wherever he goes, there are a lot of rainfalls, the crops will grow in very abundance, etc. Moreover, one time that when he was doing the Vajrakilaya, have you ever, do you know Vajrakilaya? Vajrakilaya propitiation, the statue of the Vajrakilaya laughed, literally laughed.
Were you there for that?
No, I was not there, but many of his disciples told me. And also he subdued one of the worst spirits. There was one spirit that was very attacking many beings and so on, that he subdued that.
Can you talk a little more about, too, the transition of your life from old Tibet to, I don't know, the first place you went was probably India.
Yes, that's
To
right.
Darjeeling?
Sikkim first and then
Or Sikkim. And then your life as you came to the West also. But I mean, the lives of Tibetans are quite extraordinary, and especially of your generation. Could you give us a little bit of that story, that narrative?
Yes, I remember very clearly. Actually, I came to India during the Buddha Jayanti time in 1956 also, as pilgrimage. So I know how India looks like. I managed to visit all the holy places and so on.
That was the first time you went
That
to
was the first time. And then I went back to Tibet.
Yeah. Isolde left about that same time.
Oh, yes, yes, right.
Yeah.
Yes, same
Did you
time.
see each other then?
Yes, yes.
In India?
In India.
Yeah, that's great.
Actually, many of my friends, and because the situation in Tibet was not so good so at that time, so they advised me to stay in India. But he's always told me to return back to Tibet because I was studying at that time. So to continue the studies, and so he said it's better to go back. So I went back to Tibet, 1956, 57. And then 1959, the trouble started, and then but luckily from my place to India is quite near.
And how did you get out? What pass did you go through?
It's from Sikkim.
Yeah.
It's quite near, I think it's...
At that time, Sikkim was a separate country, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And actually, from my place to the border of Sikkim, although we don't know exactly, but I don't think it's more than 60 kilometers. But there's no road, so it takes about 3 days by horse.
So you're a good horse rider.
No, I was very small at that time.
And then when you left in 59,
Yes, that's right.
you went to where?
To Sikkim.
And you stayed in Sikkim for a while?
I stayed there Sikkim about 4 or 5 months. And then came to Darjeeling and stayed in Darjeeling.
built your monastery there.
Yes, that's right.
And when you went to the West first time?
First of all, I came here was in 1974.
Huh? So you were in your 30s then?
Yes, that's
Yeah. And what was that like? What were your impressions of the West at that point?
Oh, it's very nice. I first went to Switzerland, and then England, and then Canada, and then America.
Very few Tibetans in the West at that point.
Yeah, it was very, very good.
Were you teaching then or not?
Yes, I was teaching a little bit teaching.
Okay.
Yeah, not many centers.
Yeah. No, it's such a radical change since the 70s
Yes,
until now, and how successful the Tibetan refugee community has been all over the world. I remember Gelek Rinpoche giving me a lecture one day. He says, you know, our troubles in Tibet, our diaspora, was a terrible tragedy for us, but you in the West took advantage, because you got all these wonderful teachers and lamas that came and gave you our Buddhism. But it's true. Your tragedy has been our joy in some ways.
but for us also, it is a great opportunity to learn many new things. Because when I was small, of course we heard about America, but we have very kind of strange ideas about America. We thought it's kind of another planet.
What did you think it was? What was your vision of America?
Oh, we have all kind of strange imaginations. But then one of my friends, Tibetan friends, visited America in late 40s. And he told me all about,
In the late 40s?
yes.
Wow, that's very early. How did you even get out at that point? Because there were no passports. There was no way to travel.
Yes, but they went as a kind of trade mission,
Yeah.
and actually they came to congratulate the victory, the World War victory.
I see. I think there was a connection between the Tibetans and Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Yes,
Yeah.
they met the Truman.
Truman. Yeah. Well, we've got a few more minutes here. We'll tell you about 20 minutes. We'll start some of these questions, if that's
Yes.
okay.
Sure.
Do you want to hold one of these, or should I just read to you?
Yes, I will also hold one. You read.
Okay, it's kind of a grab bag of questions here. Some of them we might have covered the territory, but we'll just start. I'll read them. By the predominance in nature of beauty and harmony over lack of beauty and disharmony, it seems nature can teach us about our true nature and essence. It's difficult to see that the tremendous beauty and elegance of our world in nature and the human being could come about merely by chance, and that there is no purpose to creation, or that there is no originator or creator involved. Did an ultimate reality wish and or manifest this marvelous world? And does this reality appreciate its manifestation through our lives? So as we were talking before, this is basically a question: is there a creator who is responsible for the beautiful things in this world?
As a Buddhist, then we do not believe in creator, and everything is actually our own karma, our own deeds. That we commit good deeds, and so therefore we are born in a good place and good life, and we do bad deeds, and then we are born in a poor place and unhappy life. But everything actually is relative. This is our mind is the most important. I feel that even if you are in the most beautiful place of the world, if your mind is not happy, then you will not feel happy. But even if your mind is happy, even in the most poor country, then one will be very happy. So it all depends on the mind. We have to make the mind through wisdom to tame our mind, to train our mind, so that we will be able to.
I remember having lunch with Lama Zopa Rinpoche in Kathmandu at his monastery. We were having lunch and we were up on top of the roof and he's very kind. He's a vegetarian, I'm a vegetarian. He's always this great cook. So I was really enjoying this time I was spending with him and he just started laughing, hysterically. And I said, Rinpoche, what are you laughing about? He said, do you realize people think their problems come from out there? I said, what a spectacle. But the truth is that all of our problems come from ourselves, from our own minds. And taming and then training our minds. Obviously we can create another experience of the world and of each other. But we certainly live in a world of projections, and the nature of our own minds is the deciding factor. Can you give a text on remaining positive through all of life's challenges and aging, and remaining positive through this period of time in life? This is obviously someone who's getting older. I don't know who that would be. So what would you do with someone who's getting obviously older, life's challenges, aging? How do they remain positive and optimistic?
I think general knowledge of teachings help us, because when you face difficulties such as our aging, then those who lack the knowledge suffers very much. But someone who has some ideas about teachings, then you can say like life is suffering, and it is obviously the birth and old age, sickness, death are one after another. Obviously, everybody is unavoidable. Yeah. Everybody have to face this. So there's no point in worrying or being sad about it, just to accept it. So the general teachings are very helpful for such person.
It all isn't permanent. Everything is changing, and that's fine. Okay. Last month at the Mind and Life conference held in Dharamsala, and actually there was, who was that there? So I just met someone before the teaching today. Was at the Mind and Life, just in Dharamsala. Anyhow, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and many scientists and educators from around the world discussed compassion-based programs in educating the younger generation. That's what the conference was on, was in fact education. How do we bring those secular ethics that His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about so much into the education systems? Could His Holiness Sakya Trinzen comment on the potential he sees for incorporating compassion-based programs into the education programs that are offered to our kids?
As I said before, the nature of human life is compassion, loving kindness, loving, but that we don't emphasize on it. In our present education program, we only emphasize on material gains. And so therefore, I think it is important from the beginning, from the young child, compassion is important for yourself, for others, for the whole life. Because the great Master Shanti Deva said, all the happiness that we experience today comes from wanting other people to make happy. And all the sufferings that we experience is coming from oneself to be happy. If you are self-centered and if you are selfish and you only want your own well-being, all you achieve is suffering. But if you think of the others and compassion, then all you gain is happiness.
Do you think, I think the question is about introducing these kind of secular ethics of compassion, love, acceptance into our school systems in a way. Obviously, that's going to be a good thing. Do you know the systems in India or in Nepal, how they teach kids? Is it radically different than how we teach kids here in terms of love and compassion?
But India and Nepal, the schools that we have now are all based on the Western way of thinking.
So they're totally screwed up at this point.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
But in the monasteries, olden time, the general public has very little education.
Of any kind?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for monasteries, of course, there's education starting from very young age.
I remember a friend of mine a couple who were going to have a kid, and they asked His Holiness the Dalai Lama how they could teach their soon-to-be-born child to be loving and compassionate. And His Holiness thought for a second, and he said, teach them to value the life of an insect. I thought, what a great answer. I mean, if you could learn to respect the life of something that by appearances is something that's ugly, it's small, you're afraid of, you could easily step on it, but to think, well, no, this had a mother and a father, this has brothers and sisters, this has a community that it's part of, it feels pleasure, it feels pain. To value the life of an insect, and make a child understand that is, I think, a lesson that one carries the rest of one's life. Next question. How can the benefits of the Nalanda tradition be made accessible to the wider world, including the majority who are not Buddhists? Many non-Buddhists are familiar with the beliefs that can arise from contemplative practices for meditation. In particular, meditation is recognized as a means to improve one's ability to focus attention and to prevent negative emotions from taking over one's mind. Can the benefits of these practices be extended or enriched by incorporating compassion into the process? If so, how can this be done? And it's kind of all over the place, this question. But maybe you'd speak a little bit to the Nalanda tradition that His Holiness the Dalai Lama speaks to all the time.
Yes. I think the Nalanda tradition is the very great, one of the most ancient great masters who came from Nalanda. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama says that we have to divide Buddhist teachings, Buddhist science, Buddhist philosophy, and Buddhist religion. Buddhist religion is specifically for the Buddhist practitioner. To do that, you have to become a Buddhist. You have to take vows. But the Buddhist science means talking about the base, talking about the world, talking about the people, talking about the whole universe. And then also what is the reality and how it is formed, how it's decayed, how it's remaining, and so on. And with this philosophy of life, shunyata, emptiness, view, etc., this can be taught to anyone without becoming Buddhist, without labeling as a Buddhist. While you are still, maybe you may be Christian, maybe Islam or Hindus, but you can still take the Buddhist teachings to enhance your own beliefs, to enhance your own wisdom.
His Holiness the Dalai Lama really speaks of the Nalanda tradition as the heart and basis of the Tibetan tradition.
Yes, that's right.
And that the great teachers, the great commentaries, and the thrust of the Buddhism that came out of this vast university in Bihar state, one of the greatest centers of learning in the history of the world, Nalanda. There were several other great universities, but I think from His Holiness's point of view, Nalanda was the greatest of the great. And it was one of those incredible places where there was a very high wall around. It's a vast place. It's thousands of acres, the Nalanda, which is a ruin now. But there were, I believe, 4 gates at the cardinal points. And the greatest minds were the gatekeepers. And you had to win a debate against one of the gatekeepers to be allowed admission into Nalanda. Just the reputation and the excellence of this place was just mind-boggling.
Actually, they are not real gatekeepers, because the temple has 4 doors.
Yeah.
And if somebody comes from it's not the real gatekeeper, so somebody comes from the eastern side to challenge, because at that time debating, so challenge you, then this pandit will challenge.
I see.
And from the southern door, if somebody comes, so they are called door guarders, but they are not a real door guarders, but they are kind of inner door guarders to debate anyone who comes to challenge.
Incredible. Okay, next, I realize this is a pessimistic question. Is there a pessimist out here somewhere? I can't believe that. But there are people who speculate that human life will end with the 6th extinction, which is us. If this in fact happens, please discuss the effects on karma. I think the question here is if people are gone, does that mean karma is gone also?
Oh, then, actually I'm optimistic.
Thank you.
And I don't believe that this will end, at least not soon. So it will go on, and even if eventually it extinct here in this world, but there are thousands, countless planets with the lives. So somewhere else there's still life, so the karma will continue there.
There's no end to karma.
There's no end to karma, no end to samsara.
You are pessimistic. Santanu Rinpoche, in a speech a few days back, he said in a speech a few days back for Tibetans to review the role of monks and nuns in politics. What does Rinpoche think about that? Well, Santanu Rinpoche is very close to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He was the head of the Kashak, so he was involved in politics, and very much so, internationally also. With the Chinese, came to the U.S. quite often, went to Europe, was himself one of those great monk, scholar, teachers who was also involved in international politics. So we had a little bit to talk about this before we came out here today. So do you have anything you'd like to say about that? Monks and nuns getting involved with politics.
Yes. I think in politics there are 2 kinds. Politics is based on the selfish reasons, to get your own positions, to get your own power, you involved in competitions, and to grab power and so on. But that kind of politics is definitely for the monks and nuns. But the politics that is to help the people, based on the genuine intuition, good thoughts, to help the socially, to help the people, to help such as Mahatma Gandhi, who never took any positions in the government, but he was the leader of the whole country. And such politics is, I think, is definitely to do with the monks and nuns.
I know that the Tibetan community is struggling with that now, certainly with His Holiness the Dalai Lama devolving his power and separating church and state. I think everyone has conflicting feelings about that. That the political structure of old Tibet had many positive things because monks were so involved with government and making major decisions. But as you say, with power comes a lot of problems. There are very few Mahatma Gandhis in the world, in any culture. So it's a great danger. What is your feeling about monks and nuns demonstrating?
Again, the same thing is for the good cause, for genuine mind. I think there's nothing wrong. But if it is based on selfish reasons with a negative thought, then it's certainly not right.
So, as usual, everything in Buddhism comes down to motivation.
Yes.
Obviously you've met so many Tibetan, not only monks and nuns, but secular people as well, who have spent 20 years, 25 years in Chinese prisons. Many of them tortured every day. And so many of them came out fresh and clear and not angry and not vengeful. Some did. Some had real problems. But there were so many who came out and saw it as extraordinary practice to live in that horrible situation. That to me is the center and the core of what you all have to offer us. Is that going back to your statement that our reality is our mind. And we do have the ability to control our minds, to work with our minds, to expand our minds. And when we meet Rinpoches like you and other great teachers, that inspires us to believe that more and more. If a practitioner is bothered by great negativity during daily practice, some might say maybe even negative spirits, what are some of the things that a practitioner can do?
The whole purpose of actually practicing is to overcome the negative deeds. So what happens is that when we are not practicing in usual life, there are so many distractions that we even do not notice. But when you sit down and when you are kind of looking into it, then it is more noticeable. But if you, as you do continuously, and when you are used to it, eventually one will be able to conquer.
I think we're getting to the end. I'll just do one more question. And this is, we'll see what we can do with this one. Is the practice of Tantra similar to engaging in viewing virtual reality? We are now able to view an imaginary universe with an imaginary narrative associated with that universe. We are able to view an imaginary personality, pretend that we inhabit that personality. In Tantra, we train ourselves to visualize a deity and become one with that deity, associating our lives with the narrative story of the deity, including all the practices of Buddha Dharma. Over time, we can, in fact, become one with the deity and achieve enlightenment in a single lifetime. Virtual reality experiments have to date demonstrated that people can change their beliefs and behavior based on the virtual personality that they embody. Is this the same practice as Tantra?
I think it's not, definitely not. Because this is just temporary creation of experience. the tumbling the deity, the image, imagination is because basically that we all have the Buddha nature. And so because of Buddha nature that we do the visualizations and meditations so that eventually that one will become, because you are right from the beginning in that nature, but at the moment we do not realize this.
But also too, as I'm painfully aware, the genuine tantric practice, one must have a genuine experience of shunya, of emptiness.
Yes.
The deity comes out of emptiness, not just because I'm
As I
visualizing.
said, basically the Buddha nature is emptiness. Buddha nature is the emptiness and the clarity, none combined, none indivisible, that is beyond description. It is not existing nor non-existing. It is beyond speech.
But can only come out of a genuine experience
Yes.
of emptiness. Yeah, thank you. I think that's about it. This was a wonderful time, wow, to spend with a great Lama, a great teacher, a great Rinpoche, who's given us his time and his energy. He was here a couple of hours before, taking pictures with everyone and meeting people. And such a great teacher, that's his life. When I saw His Holiness the Dalai Lama doing this over and over again, and he wasn't feeling well, but he was still taking pictures with people, and he said, that's my practice. That's what I do. So thank you for doing what you do, Your Holiness, and thank you for being with us tonight.